Right. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank the Reagan Institute for having me, and on behalf of the panel, I'm sure everybody else feels the same way, for what will hopefully be a very interesting conversation, both a little bit of looking back and also looking forward on education and education reform. So let's just jump right into this. A Nation at Risk, when we look back on that seminal report, really marked the starting gun for what was decades of work on education reform based on accountability and standards and raising the bar for all kids. But today when we look around, we don't really see a lot of coalitions or centricism when it comes to education. In fact, you really see Republicans moving towards emphasizing cultural issues as well as school choice. You see Democrats focusing in on racial equity and investment. And I want to ask, and this is a question I want everyone to kind of take a stab at, sort of, was that inevitable? Is it just a product of our polarized politics of today? Or is there something about what happened in the education story that explains why this coalition that persisted for quite a long time seems to have really frayed? And then we'll talk also about what happens next. But let's start there. Maybe Secretary Duncan, could you take a stab at starting us off?
I was hoping you started that end.
I was hoping the other way.
That's a smart end down there. I don't know if I can answer the historical question well. All I can say is that I desperately hope what we do in education is we fight over real small ball stuff, real things that I think are pretty insignificant at the end of the day. What I wish as a country is we could unite behind a couple goals, and I'll mention a couple goals: having access to every child to high quality pre-K, continuing to raise the high school graduation rate. There are no good jobs if you drop out of high school today. Making sure that our high school graduates are actually prepared to go to college, and trying to lead the world in college graduation rates again so we can keep high wage, high skilled jobs in our country. And I don't think any of those goals are left or right that I'm aware of, or Republican or conservative. I call those nation building goals. And if we could unite behind those goals, then we can have lots of vigorous debate about the best strategies to achieve those goals. And what works well in Montana may be very different than south side of Chicago where I am. And we can have all kinds of different people doing stuff, but following the data and being real clear. But somehow we've never been able to elevate there. So we fight about the small stuff. And if we had those goals that lasted across administrations, let's get high school graduation rates to 90%, then 93%, then 95%, and different people will have different ways. That for me would be transformational for kids. And what I worry about now, just all the noise, all the anger, viciousness, I could even say, none of that is helping more kids learn to read. None of that is helping more kids graduate and have a chance to compete in a globally competitive economy. So I worry about where we are as a nation today.
Well, just following up on that, maybe Rick, you can take a stab at this. I mean, those goals that Secretary Duncan just articulated certainly are the kinds of things I think most people would support, and yet that isn't what we're necessarily hearing from the leading voices talking about education today. And I know you've done a lot of really deep thinking about this. So why is that? Why aren't people out there shouting about pre-K as loudly as they're shouting about critical race theory or anything else?
I think the depth, how deep the thinking is open to debate. But I've certainly tried. Look, I think one thing is, I very much admire kind of the vision that Arne just sketched. But let's keep in mind that it's not the first time we did this. In 1990, President Bush 41 got together the nation's governors for only the third time in the 20th century in Charlottesville, and they convened and came out with Goals 2000. And we had a set of goals that sounded somewhat similar to what the Secretary just sketched. And we did them for 9 years, and we did them through the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and no needles moved. We were no closer to any of those goals at the end of a decade than we were at the beginning, which is partly what inspired, I've long said, kind of that era of what I call big R reform, capital reform, right? No Child Left Behind, and Nation, and Race to the Top, and the school improvement grants, and Common Core. And these were all efforts to finally, cudgel this recalcitrant system into making the changes that we yearned for. And keep in mind that Goals 2000 was not the first time we tried this. In 1890, the Committee of 10 got together to talk about what. So This is something that we have been at. And one of the realities, I think, of school improvement, school reform, is that all of us tend to think the story starts when we get on the bus. So like my experience of school reform starts when I started teaching high school in 1990 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And that's when the game really started. And everything before was prologue. And so my era of reform was the real one. And my friends, Michelle Rhee and Mike Feinberg, and these were the real reformers. And I remember, Checker Finn saying, Rick, dude, there's a whole lot that came before that you don't fully. And now I say that same stuff to other people who are excited about and I think one of the things that we need to be conscious of, and let me stop at this, Laura, is to your question about what happened to that reform. I think that era of reform, which accomplished some terrific things, including, I think, the biggest legacy for me of kind of that Clinton, Bush, Obama era, is we planted the flag that an educator was responsible for educating all kids. When I used to supervise student teachers in the 1990s, it was no trick at all to find teachers who'd say, those kids aren't here to learn. Nobody says this out loud in a school building today. Public school, charter school, private school, we have fundamentally changed the culture of what's expected of professional. Now, that doesn't mean we know how to help them learn, but it means we've changed the definition of teaching. That is a huge monumental success. But it was a product not because we could agree on the stage, but because the parties in America and the American electorate tended to reward folks who leaned to the middle, who talked about, who rewarded Republicans who could show that they were really sincere about meaning it when they talked about equality of opportunity. And that Democrats were rewarded for saying, we're not just about spending. We're really sincere that this is about investing, on return on investment in human capital. And I think we have changed. The center of gravity in American politics has changed. And so it's no great surprise to me that that reform wave, that bus we got on, has parked, and new buses are starting up. And we have to understand that we're going to need to think about how those buses are going to drive on these new roads.
Just for the record, I think anyone who cites 1890 in their answer is definitely going to be accused of being a deep thinker.
Which is part of the credentialing problem that the governor talks about.
Bill, let's take us back a little bit. You were in the Reagan Education Department when Nation at Risk the report was issued, sort of not the beginning, obviously. There were obviously many things happened before then, but perhaps the beginning for you. What do people not understand about that moment, or what do you remember about that moment? Did it feel like a big moment, a landmark thing, or did the time where some people were like, well, it's another report, we'll see? Just take us there for a little bit of perspective.
So I came to Washington actually in 1985, 2 years after the report was issued,
okay.
to work in the education department for Bill Bennett, and then became chief of staff. And it very much set our agenda, or a good part of our agenda. I'm not sure people realize this would be worth going. Someone should do it. I'm sure someone has done an intellectual or political history of this. I'm not sure when it came out, it was quite understood how much of an agenda-setting thing it would be. I feel like it was another, it was Reagan administration. It was done with some hoopla and all that. But Reagan also had campaigned on getting rid of the education department. So what was the priority? Was it getting rid of the department, or was it improving? Was it this more activist, somewhat activist role for the federal government? And that got resolved pretty well by the time I was there. So. But anyway, I do want to say it's a pleasure and really an honor to be here, since I did come here to Washington to work in the Reagan administration. It was actually slightly accidental that I knew Bill Bennett and ended up in the education department. I was no expert on education. I remember furiously as an assistant professor when Bill offered me the job to come as his assistant, reading up on education policy on 1890. That resonated a little bit. I remember reading about that 40 years ago, and I haven't thought about it since. But that's why Rick is in a prestigious think tank. Some of us are just in political hacks, And so that was very much our agenda. I do think it's unusual that a report like that has the effect it's had, and it was for the good. I asked, so I was thinking about this, and I asked Bruno Mano, who worked with me at the education department and is a major thinker in education reform. I was talking to him a week ago, and I said, well, they want me to talk a little bit about Nation at Risk. What should I say? And Bruno made the very unusual suggestion, so why don't you go reread it? You know, there's this thing called the internet. You can actually find it. You don't have to go buy it somewhere, you know. So I did look at it again, and it stands up pretty well, you know. And the core problem it identifies is pretty simple, that kids are not learning enough. We are not, you know, we're not educating our students as we should be and as they can be educated. And I think that criticism or that challenge stands up well. I'll just make two tiny little other points that struck me about it. One thing was what was really not mentioned or emphasized, which I'd say was families and parents, really. Both from a sort of, if I can put it this way, the liberal point of view of how do we help with pre-K, how do we help parents have better educational environments at home, which we know is very important for their success, not determinative, but helpful for their success once they get to the schools, and also from the, if I can put it this way, conservative point of view of parental rights and, you know, family and parental choice and so forth. Neither of those was prominent in the report. It was sort of education, K through 12, let's call it that, focused, which is fine. It just didn't deal with these other things. The other point I'd make, though, is that, and this cuts the other way, what's striking about the report, I'd totally forgotten this, is it's framed as an open letter to the American people. That's sort of what the front page says. And as Bruno pointed out to me, it's really one of the first such documents that is addressed to the American people, not to educators, you know, not to people working in the field. And I think that was a real breakthrough. And for better and worse, and sometimes there are negative aspects to this, it made helped make education an issue for the public to debate and consider. And you got to think over the long run, that's a good thing, even if at times the results of some of that public and political debates are problematic. So that was, I think, a very important, and that was very much in the spirit of President Reagan, right? I mean, he took it out of the specialists, so to speak, and out of the, you know, the particular people working on an issue, and made it a matter of much broader public debate.
Well, just like picking up on that theme about looking at the whole family and the whole child. Jeff, I want to ask you about this. You know, the work that you've done at Harlem Children's Zone and the work you're now doing in Promise Neighborhoods, I mean, really gets right at this idea that it isn't just about what happens in the classroom. It's, you know, if kids bring, you know, a whole backpack full of challenges in with them, that, you know, it's going to be really challenging to learn anything. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what you've learned about how to make that kind of a model work. What works and what doesn't work. Obviously, there are no magic bullets. I think we all know that. But talk a little bit about that as a strategy.
Well, back in 1797, I don't know what was going on there. I just wanted to be considered deep. That's all. So there are a couple of things I think that are really important. Number one, it is politics around education. And the way I'll describe it is when we were fighting for charter schools, my Democratic friends, I was, you know, persona non grata. They were just like, my Republican friends embraced me. Now my Republican friends can't stand me. They're like, oh, you're going for all that other stuff, my Democratic friend. So I think that often education has become a political cudgel that we've used to sort of make certain points, and it often doesn't last, right? Like 4 or 5, 6 years later, you're like, oh, okay, that one's over. What's the new one? And I think the system has learned to outlast, right? They'll be gone, yeah, you know, maybe 1 term, 2 terms, they'll be out of there and everything will get back to normal, which for our kids, and I'm talking poor kids in this country, has been a disaster, right? And it has been a disaster. Part of the challenge I think we face in education is that there is a science to this. We have decided that it doesn't matter how destitute, how sort of undermined communities are, how many of the sort of societal structures are failing in places, that we expect that school to solve all of those problems for those kids and equalize for those kids who are struggling on every level with kids who are growing up in upper middle class community. There's just no evidence that works. And so you can get caught up into the debates about one thing or the other, but the science on this is clear. Starting at conception, if you don't have really good health care, these children are going to suffer. 0 to 3, that brain development work, I mean, the science on this is not ambiguous. No one's debating it anymore. So what are we doing to make sure those young brains are getting wired for success That's still an anomaly in most places. It's pretty clear. ACEs is real. Adverse childhood experiences, that trauma early on in life stays with kids forever. Just imagine the trauma our kids are going to. We were there here with Christian Rose, who was worked for Secretary Cardona, and we were visiting a school, and I was noticing how prominent keep these doors locked are. Yeah, because they come in, they want to kill our kids in school. I mean, we have created an environment for young people that they are suffering emotionally, their families are struggling, you've got homeless children, and we keep thinking, let's just send those kids into that traditional public school and this thing is going to work. It's never worked. And our belief is, you have to start basically cradle to career. You've got to make sure you're supporting families and children. You've got to get these kids. So, look, if you start 2 years behind in kindergarten, we've just not figured out a way to catch those kids up. We know, I think, what to do. It is what's going on in promised neighborhoods, what's going on in full-service community schools. The problem is we have an education system, K-12 over here. And you've got all of these other supports for children. And they're not integrated, they don't talk to one another, and they're not valued by one another. And where we find that you bring those forces together, and you really can provide good health, good mental health, good social services to children, additional extra support after schools, evenings, weekends, summertime, we find that you can begin to eliminate some of these academic differences. It is not easy, it's complicated, it's not political. I don't care what side of the coin you were on. No one, I think, denies that giving young people those kinds of basic services that those of us in the middle class take for granted is an evil thing or a bad thing. I think we just haven't scaled it and we just haven't stayed with it long enough.
Well, why not? I'd love for any of the other three of you to answer that question. Like, why, given what he just laid out, which has some logic to it, I think we would all agree. What are the barriers to doing that kind of work, that whole family, whole community, whole child, and I'm not talking about social emotional development per se, but basic needs meeting.
I'll take one stab, and I've thought about this a lot, is no one votes on education. And kids don't have lobbyists, they don't have a union, and there's a massive disconnect in our country. If you look at the research, basically almost anywhere you look, 80 to 90% of parents think their kids are on track, and 20 to 30% of kids actually are. So it's not just a perception gap, it's a reality gap. And every parent in the country, rich, poor, black, white, it doesn't matter, they all want the best for their kids, but they don't truly know where their kids are because we don't tell them the truth about where they are. And if more parents vote on education, again, across the political spectrum, that would change everything. But there's a complacency and acceptance, and I sort of blame us that we haven't better worked with parents and educated them about the reality of where their kids are, because then they would demand the kinds of things that Geoff is doing. No one's knocking down anyone's door saying Harlem Children's Zone should be everywhere. That should be the norm. And what the work he's done is extraordinary. But that's top down. That's not bottom up. So somehow, if parents were demanding a world-class education, if parents were demanding that their schools be safe from gun violence, our nation would change. And we have to sort of wake parents up across the political spectrum.
But why isn't, I'd like maybe either of the other two to weigh in on this. That makes sense that you need demand from constituents, but you also need leadership. So why isn't there more from the top pushing these ideas, or are they not the right ideas?
So, I mean, I guess I would say is, when I see what Geoff has done, I am filled with admiration. And I think if you do it with the intent and the purposefulness and the execution that Geoff and the people Geoff's worked with it transforms lives. But I think we've also seen, and we can take this back to comprehensive school reform in the 90s, we can take this back to site-based management and block scheduling in the 80s, we can take this to $8 billion spent on school improvement grants, which were found to have null effects across the board in 2008, we have a long history of looking at models which are incredibly powerful when executed in particular settings, when schools and leaders have opted to be part of this, when there are memoranda of understanding with teacher associations that permit the work to be executed, when the investors and the supporters are giving tender loving care and making sure these folks are getting the coaching. And then we take these things to scale and you see fundamentally different results. And in fact, what those taking it to scale often results in is lots of money spent, lots of new jobs, lots of new programs, none of which you can either reform or zero out if they don't work. And you wind up with an expansion of what feels like kind of the permanent education bureaucracy, whether we're talking pre-K, K-12, or higher ed. So I think on the right, particularly, you've seen lots of skepticism take place over time. Since Nation at Risk, we've doubled real per pupil after inflation spending. And I think a lot of folks look around and say, wait a minute, a lot of folks on the right particularly say, we get it. We're supportive of what we're trying to do. When I hear Geoff speak, I am mesmerized. When I hear the secretary talk about how important it is that we work together, but I'm just not confident that we have any idea how to translate the promising initiatives and models that Geoff is talking about into large-scale solutions. And there, I think that's where our fundamental philosophical disagreement is, right? Conservatives, progressives who are like, we can make this world better, and we've just got to keep fighting at it. And conservatives who are like, whoa, what's going to get damaged along the way, and you don't know what you're doing. And because we right now, at this point in history, through social media and polarization, aren't good at having mature adult arguments, we wind up saying that they don't get it. And then we just keep screaming at each other. And what's a fundamental, principled, honest disagreement winds up looking a lot like a childish food fight. But that doesn't mean it is a food fight. It just means it looks like one.
Very interesting. Bill, picking up on that, how would you describe the state of politics today around education? And what concerns you, and where do you see any sort of hope around this?
Yeah, I think the polarization is obvious and very important as a problem. When I was with Bill Bennett in 85 to 88, he was a pretty conservative Reagan cabinet member, pretty combative and polemical on a whole bunch of issues. But we routinely worked with Democratic governors, with Democratic superintendents in cities. Sometimes we had to go around the governors if they really weren't for education reform to get to the mayors and stuff. But it was just, we didn't even think twice about it. That's part of education reform. I remember meeting Hillary Clinton for the first time when she came up to some meeting that we had some committee or something bipartisan, local and state officials in '86, and she represented Bill Clinton and the state of Arkansas. And it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like, oh wow, you have a Democratic governor here in a meeting in the Reagan Education Department. And so I do think the polarization has been very damaging, and that's mostly not due to education. That's just education's a victim of a much broader social and political forces. The other thing I would say, if you think about each party, how much oomph is there behind education reform these days? I'd say Republican, if you think, both parties are dominated by, let's call it middle class electorates of a different type, but basically, and they are either pretty content with their kids' education or focused on the particular things they don't like about their kids' education, but they're not so focused on poor kids, I think. Yeah. And you could, in the past, each party in different ways has decided to focus on that very much. And that's just not the case today for various reasons. I think about our kids went to Northern Virginia public schools. Our kids, or some of them are in Northern Virginia public schools. A couple other kids are in little preschools in Westchester County. And they're all very involved in their kids' education. But there's no one party I'm just thinking about Virginia, New York, these different states. The governors, who were impressive, incidentally, I think, as a general matter, Shapiro, Whitmer, Polis, Pritzker on the Democratic side, Kemp or Sununu on the Republican side. Some of them are better than others, I suspect, on education from a reform point of view. Some of them are more knowledgeable. But I wouldn't say, if you sort of ask what's their calling card, it isn't really education reform, and it's not really a little bit of excellence maybe, but not much of the sort of upward mobility side of it. So I think the politics in neither party, to caricature, You have a Democratic Party dominated by sort of upper middle class, college educated people, which I'm one, so that's fine, I think. But they're worried about their kids, and they're worried about a million other things, as they have to be and should be in the country and in the world. And so education reform for others, if I can put it that way, and it isn't quite top of the list. The Republican Party is dominated by a slightly different socioeconomic demographic, but it also has its own issues and concerns. But again, the kind of things that Jeff was talking about aren't foremost. So I think it's not a great political situation, both in terms of polarization, but in terms of the internal dynamics of each party. I mean, would Arne be an education secretary in the Democratic administration today? Would Lamar be an education secretary, Lamar Alexander, in a Republican administration today? Not so likely, maybe.
I want to ask about another issue that is probably more front of mind to educators today than probably any of the stuff we're talking about, which is the COVID relief money, the ESSER funding, which is going to expire soon. Obviously, that was the deal from the beginning. Everyone knew this was a short-term amount of funding, but are schools really prepared for the fact that this is going to go away, and will this create its own set of problems if there have been, in fact, people hired, programs put in place that depend on this money?
Well, I would start by saying it was unprecedented, the amount of funding went into education. And I would love to say the education system was one that could look at this sort of bountiful thing and make really solid, great plans and spend the money wisely in a timely fashion. Not here on planet Earth. I'm sure somewhere that happens. But so this is the challenge. The money, it was the right thing to do. What has happened because of COVID to our children? People think that we've seen the worst of this. We have not. We won't know how bad this is for probably another 2 or 3 years. It is devastating to poor kids. It's been devastating to all kids, but to poor kids, this is really devastating. And these kids are going to actually be further behind than before COVID happened, when we were all fighting to try and catch kids up. So we needed the extra resources. The fact it was too short a time frame, because most folks were so afraid of the fiscal cliff that they didn't spend the money on what it was meant for. How do you sort of deal with learning loss? And the ones who decided to spend the money and hire people are now terrified that I'm not going to be able to fund these folks as tax revenues decrease and we're thinking about cutbacks. There was not a really, I think, solid, organized plan for how we were going to implement this. But here's the challenge. The kids are going to need this more next year than they need it right now, even as the money's running out. And people are just going to throw up their hands and say, what can we do? And I think that's going to be a disaster. This idea of, could we find really high qualified tutors for kids? Could we expand summer school? Look, in New York today, they just announced 45,000 parents signed up for our Summer Rising program. Then we have seats for. We're going to deal with 45,000 families say, yes, I need my kids somewhere this summer, and there's no chance for that to happen, even while we're dealing with 95,000 kids that will be. Every kid who is struggling in a community needs to have summer activities. We know these kids actually lose ground over the summertime, and we're not going to be prepared to provide these services. Look, schools are actually going in some places to 4 days a week. They can't find teachers. They're really worried about how they're going to manage these businesses. For me, this is a crisis. Right at the time, I'm sure this is going to happen, they're going to say, we put all that money in, and what did we get? Nothing. So therefore, don't put any more money in because it doesn't deliver, right? Support, and that argument's going to look really logical and sound, except for the fact that our kids are going to need additional supports for real for the next 3 to 5 years at a minimum if we're going to make up for this learning loss that's happened.
I mean, that's just such an important point that you were talking about the failures or lack of successes of the previous reform area. I mean, we've in fact actually had things have gotten worse. Due to the pandemic. I mean, significantly so. I mean, the data is really uncontrovertible in that.
Can I just add one thing on that? I mean, I'd just say I'm reporting on this, not endorsing this, but I would say among people I talk to, let's just call them moderate, never Trump Republican types or moderates, whatever, the degree to which I very much agree with Jeff, this problem is going to get worse, is that there's much more skepticism than there had been pre-pandemic about whether the schools would spend this money wisely, or whether you could trust the schools. I don't mean trust in a kind of right wing, they're out to groom kids way. I just mean trust them to be competent and serious about improving the education system. I mean, many neighbors of mine who are kind of your standard swing voter types in Northern Virginia, they were so unhappy with fairly or unfairly, but the image they have now of the Fairfax County Public Schools, which is a highly regarded public school system where our kids went and our grandchildren go, and where their kids went, though not all of them are still in it, incidentally. Some of them went to parochial schools and private schools. The image they have of the school systems is not positive in terms of, are they up to this challenge? So I think you're going to have a combination of a genuine, as you say, education problem and kid problem on the one hand, and among at least a certain chunk of the electorate. Again, this isn't the sort of anti-public education part of the electorate. These are people whose kids, people moved to Fairfax County to be in those public schools, in that public school system, right? But they do not have the same attitude towards the schools that they had, in my opinion, 4 or 5 years ago. So.
Well, we've got a little more than 5 minutes left here. Let's. What can we do? Like, what's the?
Give that one to Arne over there.
That question has Arne Duncan all over it.
Let's take us somewhere forward moving. I mean, given what we're facing, the politics and the deep learning losses that we've seen, and given the world we live in, not the world we wish we lived in, what are some promising things happening, and where can we move forward?
We can all head for the bus now and get out of here. And I'll say one.
But that's a good metaphor, right? Like the next bus.
I just so appreciate the conversation. I think this seems to happen so rarely, and just to try and think about this thoughtfully and challenge each other is just so. I just appreciate being here, and I'm trying to really hear Rick's question about, can we scale things that make sense. Having said that, my inclination is we have to try. And it may be imprecise, so a couple things to think about. One is we've had a K-12 system for 100 years that helped build the middle class. I would argue that's insufficient. I think we need a pre-K through 14 system. And we got to start with our babies much earlier, and some kind of 4-year university, 2-year community college, trade, technical, vocational training. You can't get a good job without a high school diploma, with only a high school diploma. So I think we have to move to a different system. Secondly, it's just interesting in this conversation for me to just talk about money. Money is an input. I want to talk outcomes. What cities, what states have done the best job of closing the gap? Which states, what districts did the best job of pulling kids back in who never came back to school? I don't think we know that. And we just have to have honest conversations about who's done well and who hasn't with these resources. The money's never the answer. It's what are the outcomes from it? And Jeff said it. Kids throw tomatoes at, summer should be obsolete for many, many kids in our country. My kids can go to summer camp, or if they got no musical ability, but they want to take piano lessons, they could do that. But the idea that kids who are 2, 3, 4 years behind, we give them more time off is insane to me. We're handicapping them. So I would argue move to a pre-K to 14 system, have not mandatory summer for all, but have the option for summer for every kid that needs it. We need more time. And if we did those things, that puts us in the game. And then finally track the data relentlessly across the country and just have honest conversations of where we're moving the needle and not, and learn from where we are and challenge where we're not.
Rick, do you see anything out there today that you think is promising?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. And I really love what the secretary just said. And I think let me just so echo his point about, it's so nice to be these constructive conversations where we can disagree and we can see things differently, but we're disagreeing and seeing things differently from experience and principle, not because that's how you get clicks. And so I think there's a couple things. One thing that the pandemic did was it rattled this relationship between parents and schools. When so many of these other what feel like cultural fights, whether it was about masking 2 years ago or critical race theory or gender, is partly a consequence of that rattled trust. That custodial, hey, I dropped my kids off with you and don't think about it, got changed when parents were watching their kids. Right? We had we had a second grader and a pre-K and right? Like that experience of trying to stand in and do all those things. When schools are asking parents to be the IT troubleshooter and be the person who's handling the homework assignments, and it's very hard to say, okay, now back to normal. And so partly we're living with the aftermath of that. And I think one thing this has done is the Secretary is right that American schooling has played a big role in kind of building this middle class, but it was also a middle class built for the 20th century. Keep in mind that, right, Horace Mann's Common School movement was not about jobs, it was about making Catholic immigrants less Catholic. And, right, that's why they had to read the King James Bible. And so they built a teacher labor force that could make sure Catholics read the King James Bible. And then progressives at the dawn of the 20th century, they wanted to get kids out of the labor force as part of their effort. So schools were supposed to warehouse kids. And they did that pretty effectively. And at the time, in 1900, 4 out of 5 jobs were farms or factories. So a third grade education was just fine. We live in a fundamentally different world today. We're asking our schools to do fundamentally different things. And we forget how recent the burdens we place on schools are. It wasn't until after World War II that most Americans graduated high school. So we've only really had this norm of high school graduation for less than 3 generations. And almost as soon as we actually got kids into school every day, we now said, oh, by the way, we need you to educate an incredibly diverse population for a knowledge economy. And it turns out that Horace Mann schools weren't built for it. And so I think part of what we're seeing is this intersection. 1, we've seen the shake and trust. 2, we've seen the realization that a whole bunch of big R reforms over a 20 or 30-year window were not enough to cudgel Horace Mann Schoolhouse into something that's meeting the challenges Jeff's talking about. And what you're seeing, I think, one of the reasons I'm so optimistic and hopeful is I think a lot of what we see as talk about school choice is actually talk about renegotiating the relationship between teachers and schools, between parents and schools. We talk about whose side are you on? Parents or schools? You know who doesn't see the world that way? Parents. 75% of parents give their kids public school an A or a B. 75% of parents say they want more school choice, whether it's charters, vouchers, ESAs. And now they're not necessarily thinking about our fights, they're thinking about microschools and course choice and learning pods and all the So let me stop at this. New York City says they don't have enough room to serve these kids, and I completely agree with the Secretary about summer vacation. We started summer vacation not because of agrarian calendar, because Boston and Baltimore were cesspools in the summer, and you had to get kids out now having kids running around these cities for 10 weeks with no productive activity is dangerous. It's digitally dangerous and it's practically dangerous. But do you know that New York City is spending $38,000 per kid this year? Yeah. They're spending $38,000 per kid, and they can't figure out how to create enough slots in their summer program to make sure that they can accommodate the 1 out of 20 kids they say they can't handle. That says to me, not that we need to put more money in, but that we need to ask, what are we doing with the dollars and the time and the tools that we have? And I think that is a huge opportunity for new cross-partisan coalitions to form.
Well, we are exactly out of time. That's probably a note that President Reagan would appreciate ending on. So I want to thank our panel for being here today and thank all of you for your attention.